first CMASTE seminar of 2022. This is really exciting to see the turnout this afternoon. I think it's actually one of our largest turnouts for CMASTE seminar this year. So welcome. In the Zoom environment, just to let you know, we will be recording this presentation. And so if you don't feel comfortable with your face being seen as a little box, then you might just want to turn your camera off. If you would like to ask the presenters some questions, you can either enter a question in the chat function while they're presenting, and we'll ask those questions to the presenters at the end, or we're still a small enough group that you can also just raise your hand at the end, and we'll take some questions then as well. But thank you for coming, and I'm going to turn it over to Florence Glanfield now for a territorial or land acknowledgement and introductions.
Thank you so much, Janelle. And good afternoon, good evening, because I know there are people that are joining us internationally as well as across this place we now call Canada. So I'm not sure where you all are, but I would like to just briefly introduce, I'm Florence Glanfield. I'm a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. And last year I had the honor of serving as acting co-director for CMASTE. But in my role as Vice Provost Indigenous Programming and Research, I also got to learn about the work that you're going to hear about today. So I was so excited when our colleagues Brenda, Carrie, and Tracy agreed to participate in this seminar. So wherever you are located, I invite you to consider the Indigenous territories where you are situated. The University of Alberta, its buildings, labs, and research stations are primarily located on the traditional territories of Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, and Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe nations. Lands that are now known as Treaty 6, 7, and 8, and homeland of the Métis. Our institution respects the sovereignty, lands, histories, languages, knowledge systems, and cultures of all First Nations, Métis, Inuit nations. And today you will hear about the great work that happened through tracking changes, and particularly with the Indigenous communities in the Mackenzie River Basin. So most often Treaty 8 and into the other treaties, I think Treaty 11 as well, right, Brenda? And into some Inuit and territory as well. So I turn it over to our colleagues from the Faculty of Agriculture, Life and Environmental Sciences, Brenda, Tracy, and Carrie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Florence, and thank you to all of you who are joining and the team who has welcomed us into this virtual space. Even though we aren't in the same physical space, I feel some positive energy from the discussions we've had already, and it's always a great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about this project. I'm Brenda Parlee. I'm a professor, as Florence said, in the Faculty of Agriculture, Life and Environmental Sciences. I'm joining you today from Treaty 7 territory in the homeland of the Métis. I'm hiding out down here in southern Alberta with my kids who were disrupted by COVID, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to work from home, sometimes in my pajamas, but I'm not wearing my pajamas today. So tracking change, we're going to talk about a little bit of the background about the project, and then I'll just share it or give the torch to Carrie, who's kind of the star of the show in terms of talking about some of the curriculum today. I'd just like to acknowledge before we get started, however, that this project has been almost an 8-year-long collaboration with some absolutely amazing people throughout the Mackenzie River Basin. So if you're familiar with the geography, and I'll show you a map in a minute, Edmonton is just south of the basin. The water flows north into the Inuvialuit settlement region and into the Beaufort Sea. So there's a lot of really amazing ecological dimensions of the story we're going to tell you today, but it's also a rich socio-political cultural landscape that if you ever get the chance to travel to visit the Gwich'in, the Satu, the Deicho, the Tlichong, Denisotlin territories, the Korean territories, the Inuvialuit communities who were a part of this project, I know you'll just have the most amazing experience. We're not, I'm a non-Indigenous scholar, and the Traditional Knowledge Steering Committee of the Track and Change project comprised of Vice Chief Joseph Tassani from Prince Albert Grand Council, Leon Andrew from the Satu Renewable Resource Board, Lana Lowe from Fort Nelson First Nation in British Columbia. We've also had some amazing participation from Alberta, Cleo Reese from Fort McMurray First Nation, and many others who have participated over the last 8 years. So the project's been guided by leaders from the Mackenzie River Basin, who, when we started talking about this project back in, oh my goodness, Tracy, when was that? 2013? Is that possible? The premise or the rationale behind this project was that there are so many changes going on in the Mackenzie River Basin, but a lot of what's been documented about the changes in that river system have been documented from the perspective of natural scientists, and very little resources and supports for Indigenous communities to tell their own stories about changing water levels, the impact of climate change, how their knowledge is important to youth and the sustainability of their cultures and practices. And that became the starting point, or essentially the gap that we identified and sought to find funding for that project. If you can just go back one slide, Trace. So we were lucky to have been awarded a SSHRC partnership grant, which is a academic source of funding that allowed us to support numerous projects over a 6-year period, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So there's lots of moving parts to this project. The Mackenzie River Basin is huge, and so many amazing communities and community members involved. We also had sister projects in Thailand and in Brazil, but we're not going to talk about that today because that's a whole other webinar we could focus on. One of the moving parts that became very clear, or one of the priorities, I should say, of the Traditional Knowledge Steering Committee, the elders, the leaders of the project, was the importance of engaging youth, and that this project shouldn't just result in reports that get put on shelves or academic publications, but should in fact lead to empowering youth, providing opportunities for youth to learn as well. So this curriculum development component became one way that we, as in the academic lingo, say, mobilize the knowledge from the project. We wanted to give it wheels, or an opportunity to transpose the ideas from the project, the evidence that was gathered, the data that was collected over 6 years into materials that could be useful for schools. And so that's how we got here. I guess in Florence thought, hey, this might be interesting for this group. So that's how we ended up here. So Carrie Karsgaard, Tracy, Mackenzie, and Alexandria Catholic, who is an undergraduate student who just graduated actually from the University of Alberta Faculty of Native Studies. Alexandria is from Tsuut'ina First Nation. So she worked with Carrie and put together the modules that you're going to be introduced to today that fit within the Science 7 to 10 curriculum of Alberta, and may in fact be transferable to other jurisdictions as well. So it's I guess I come to you humbly as a non-Indigenous scholar, talking about work that we did with a very large team and an amazing group of Indigenous leaders and scholars. And so rather than considering this presentation a kind of comprehensive overview of everything, certainly consider it the other way. This is we're sort of opening the door for you to have deeper conversations with Indigenous communities in the Mackenzie, and we can certainly share more names and contact information, and or, you know, in different parts of Canada, these same kinds of ideas or these same insights might catalyze some conversations between schools in your region and Indigenous peoples in your regions. Next slide. That was a long preamble. I should giddy up and keep going. So the concept of Indigenous knowledge may or may not be familiar to you. There are numerous definitions of Indigenous knowledge that have been used or cited. We see it in government policy. We see it in the Canadian environmental assessment processes. We see it talked about in the media. We see it in climate change discussions and narratives. It's something maybe that you've just had some awareness of recently, particularly as we grapple in Canada or come to terms with the very difficult colonial histories and the reconciliation that is long overdue between settlers and Indigenous peoples. The discoveries of residential school graves in Canada, in British Columbia, in Saskatchewan and elsewhere have really, I think, catalyzed some conversations, some long overdue conversations about the necessity of understanding that the history, difficult as it has been, and to really look at ways that we can learn together. But Indigenous knowledge has existed for generations and generations. Just because a policymaker in one province has discovered it doesn't mean that it's a new phenomenon, that Indigenous knowledge has been generated over many generations. It's often passed down orally. And these are just some characteristics that if you look more closely, you'll find more detailed conversations, and certainly more detailed definitions about what Indigenous knowledge is from the perspective of Indigenous communities. So in Inuit territories, Inuit knowledge is Inuit Kayumaya Tunganik, and I have very poor Inuktitut. In Cree territory, Indigenous knowledge is defined in the Cree language. So Indigenous knowledge is just an overview kind of title that we use for what are very complex, highly sophisticated knowledge systems that have developed around places related to how waters flow, how animals migrate, how fish might be considered healthy or not healthy. And so it's, again, this is just kind of a glimpse, I guess, into some of these issues. Next slide. I think I talked a little bit about this already. I jumped ahead, but if you're interested in learning more about how this project came about, and also understanding more about the projects or the work that was done under Track and Change, you can check out our website, which is trackingchange.ca. Next slide. This is the map of the Mackenzie River Basin that shows some of the sub-basins. It's a little bit more detailed than I have time to provide you an overview of, but over 3 or 4 year period, we funded projects by 12 different Indigenous organizations. I think there were 30 projects in total over that period of time. Though they were Indigenous-led projects, Indigenous communities decided on the work that they wanted to do, the focal points of research. They came together early in the project to kind of define the parameters, the key questions that they wanted to address, such as, can I drink the water? Can I eat the fish? We should all work together to gather information about these questions, since people at Fort McMurray First Nation, the issues that Fort McMurray sees end up as downstream issues for the Decho nations. The issues of climate change are ones that are experienced right across the basin, and people could learn from one another. And so again, a high priority in the conversations was around youth and youth engagement. Next slide. Again, you can have a look at our website. We're really excited to have been able to piece together a lot of the ideas and the reports and highlight the team on that website, and including some key indicators, or we've kind of organized the information around different indicators, perceptions of risk, habitat quality, water quality, the water levels, which I mentioned already. So there's a whole range of I guess, data points or variables that community partners and graduate students work together to address. So we know something about water levels in Aklavik, the Decho region, in Tsuske, in that region, in Lesser Slave Lake, and communities were able to come together and say, these are our issues with water levels. What's going on here? What about you guys further north? Or what about you guys in the east? Do you have these same issues around changing water levels? And that kind of knowledge sharing between communities was really the heart of the project. Next slide. So there's a number of key findings, which maybe we'll have time to discuss in more detail after Carrie does her presentation, but I think I'm over the time that I allocated myself to talk about the background of the project, and would really like to hand the mic over to Carrie to talk about the curriculum projects.
Thanks, Brenda. I'll pick up right where Brenda left off and talk a little bit about how all of this work has been translated into teacher resources and lesson plans for schools and young people, particularly in junior high or middle school and high school. And so we connected, working together with that team that Brenda mentioned earlier, all of this research, robust research from across the Mackenzie River Basin to, in this case, Alberta and Northwest Territories curriculum, although there are many, many links as well to other formal curricula across the country. And you'll probably hear echoes of, if you're from outside Alberta, hear echoes of your own curriculum and what we're talking about today. And so we developed a series of lesson plans for grades 7 to 12, and we created these as a team and also worked with one teacher and one high school student from the Northwest Territories, from the region, to gather feedback and refine these lessons in a way that would serve teachers and also connect with young people in that region as well as elsewhere. And so I'm going to talk through the ways that we configured the lessons a little bit, but I also would love for you to reflect on how you might bring these into your own teaching practice if you're a teacher, because we're really interested in how you might bring these to life in your class, and would certainly value any of the feedback that you have as far as what this might look like in a lived classroom. And so I just want to briefly talk about how we connected this work and to support teachers from both Indigenous backgrounds and non-Indigenous backgrounds, as well as linking this to the formal curriculum. And this is important for non-Indigenous educators like myself who maybe feel more or less comfortable working with Indigenous knowledge in science classes, but also for Indigenous teachers who are thinking about how to really deepen the space for Indigenous knowledge in their science classes and connecting students, particularly from these backgrounds, to their own histories and lands and languages and cultures in vital ways. And so if you want to move this slide, Tracy. Just to start, we began to find ways right within the program of studies in Alberta that, or find spaces within the program of studies that would open space to really deeply and meaningfully engage with Indigenous knowledge. And so there are many places, both through the specific learning outcomes, but also through some of the higher level aims as far as incorporating Aboriginal worldviews into all subject areas, including science. And so for some teachers, like I mentioned, this is already elemental to thinking and teaching, whereas for others, there might be a little bit more background learning required. And so we created a few teacher resources that are on the website as well to support those teachers. And so there's a couple examples on the screen. Just to look at Science 10, you can see that directly in the program of studies, it says that students will not only learn to acknowledge the contributions of Aboriginal people to understandings of the natural world, but also develop the concept of our own connectivity to the natural world and the importance of caring for the environment. And so this provides curricular foundations for bringing this work directly into your classroom. And so on the next slide, you can see some of the highlights of how these lessons function. We've tried to bring in sort of multimodal ways of learning, as well as inquiry-based lessons that really connect young people with Indigenous knowledge, and where they can, Indigenous knowledge holders. And so there's invitations for students to connect to community members in the lessons, but also where that may not be possible, lots of quotes from Indigenous knowledge holders of environmental health and change. Students also engage with what might be considered more traditional science practices, such as water testing and using sensors. But they also get to work with Indigenous knowledge, both through hearing from elders and also by connecting with Indigenous languages. So we have word banks associated with each lesson of Indigenous words in 5 regional languages. So Beaver and Slavey Dene languages, Cree, Inuvialuit, and Gwich'in. And so students also have opportunities to interview elders and speak with people in their communities, to watch videos, to share their own knowledge through a youth knowledge fair, which is a format that is sort of like a science fair, but working with Indigenous knowledge instead of traditional science, and sort of expanding that idea of what might be possible in a science fair. And also qualitative and quantitative surveys and case studies. And we'll look at one of those today. And so on the next slide, you can see the headings of some of the science 7 and 8 lessons, focusing on aquatic health, both for water and fish, and also of ice, and some of the changes to the land that have resulted from climate change and industrial development, and impacting the health of freshwater systems. And at the bottom, I think it's already been put in the chat for you. There's a link if you want to read any of these lessons in more detail. And then the next slide shows some of the lessons from Science 10 and Experiential Science 30, where that is available. And we're actually going to look at one of these Science 10 lessons today, just to get a feel for what some of the lesson plans look like. And so on the next slide, you can see an introductory slide for Science 10 lesson on global climate change and rivers in different biomes. And in this lesson, students get to think about and consider human impacts on river systems and the contributions of these human activities to climate change, as well as the value of listening to local people and Indigenous people in considering how to address these issues. And in doing so, they're actually going to compare across 3 river systems, learning from the Amazon, the Mekong, and the Mackenzie rivers and biomes in order to compare and contrast climate change contributions and effects in different river systems. And so you can access all of the lesson plans on the website. And from this page, then you can download the full lesson plan and a package to use in your classroom with all of the handouts and links and rubrics and those kinds of things. And so today I've taken some screenshots so you can follow along, but all of these materials are available online. And so on the next slide, you can see we've linked each of the lessons, in this case with the Alberta Program of Studies. And so this lesson really connects to outcomes from the unit on energy flow and global systems. And so, for instance, this lesson addresses how climate affects the lives of people and other species, and students explain the need to investigate climate change. They also identify potential effects of climate change on environmentally sensitive biomes, in this case, river systems. And so on the next slide, you can also see some of the other outcomes that are met. So for instance, students will assess from a variety of perspectives the risks and benefits of human activity and its impact on the biosphere and the climate. And the lesson also meets an attitude outcome as far as encouraging students to appreciate that scientific understanding evolves from the interaction of ideas involving people with different views and backgrounds. And so the students get to examine Indigenous clothing, ways of life, recognize that science and technology develop in response to global concerns and local needs, and how the local and the global are really interconnected in this lesson. So let's get to it. Let's see what it looks like. On the next slide, you can see some snippets from the materials for this lesson plan. And essentially it's laid out so that the students are warmed up to the lesson by watching a video about Indigenous people who shared their knowledge of river systems at the United Nations. And the video helps students see international links between climate change and issues facing different rivers in the world, as well as the importance of Indigenous knowledge in dealing with climate change, and in fact, how that might inform the policy level at the UN. And so then after the video, students get to engage with a series of case studies to understand how these issues take effect in the Mekong, the Amazon, and the Mackenzie River Basins. And so each case study involves a number of components, and you can see the Mekong on the screen. The case studies are pretty comprehensive. They provide an introduction to regional climate issues, an overview of the types of research used to understand these issues, quotes from Indigenous knowledge holders, some snippets of language, and considerations moving forward. And because they're so robust, they're intended to be flexible so that teachers could take pieces of them or use the full package depending on you and your students and how you understand their familiarity with the topic and their ability to process this information. And so there's still a lot of flexibility built in for teachers as well. And so on the next slide, you can see how after working with the case studies, students have an opportunity to apply their learning to design presentations in response to inquiry questions. And these inquiry questions on the screen align with learning outcomes for this lesson, which again are oriented around the Alberta Program of Studies in this case. And so for instance, if they're thinking about the first one, climate change in river systems, their prompt is how do changes to freshwater ecosystems around the world contribute to climate change? What role do human actions play in these changes to freshwater ecosystems? How does this affect local communities like food, cultural traditions, mobility? One of the case studies really focuses on the experiences of women. And how do the communities respond? And then they get to think about how does this compare to the way climate change is related to your local freshwater ecosystem? So this helps them connect their scientific learning to broader issues. And so we've included in here a full presentation assignment with a rubric, but as a teacher myself, I also know that each of you might want to adapt these in different ways, whereas some of you might find them directly applicable to your classroom. And so obviously how you use them is up to you. But our hope is that we've provided enough tools here for your students to learn from Indigenous knowledge and research with Indigenous peoples in order to respond to some meaningful inquiry questions and think about how their learning might contribute to potentially policy, governance, decision-making informed by communities. And so if we had more time today, it would be so much fun to print these all off and get everyone moving around the room and looking at them and experimenting and talking about how they might play into your work in the classroom. But if you've clicked on the link and are kind of scrolling through and thinking about them, we do have a little bit of time for questions or reflections on how you could see these taking life in your classrooms. Because we don't really have that same hands-on flexibility as usual. So we'd love to hear from you today or in a follow-up later if you have any questions. And so that's all I have to share. I don't know if Brenda, you have anything else you want to add in conclusion?
Just a huge thanks to all of the organizations and governments and individuals, Indigenous governments that led the projects, and then also worked to support Carrie in translating the knowledge that was documented into these curriculum. And I should also point out, I guess as a last point, that Carrie didn't necessarily introduce herself. And it's kind of late in the process to tell you, she's got a big CV that's highly relevant to this discussion, having been a former teacher, high school teacher, and also just about to graduate from the Faculty of Education with her PhD. So big congratulations to Carrie for this awesome work.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation. It was really exciting for me to see the comprehensive, engaging, and wide variety of materials that are included in each of these lessons. I can imagine, as a former high school math teacher, how the examples you showed us, Carrie, would really resonate with students in classrooms. So thank you very much. I'd like to open up the floor to any questions that participants or attendees this afternoon might have for Carrie, Brenda, and Tracy. I haven't seen any questions in the chat so far, so if you want to just turn your camera and microphone on,